There's been some interesting debate going on at the front of the F1 grid recently, with discussions amongst all the teams actually about whether they should change back to the 2018 specification of tyres, effectively in a bid to bring back Mercedes, who appear to have made such a jump with the new specification for this year. We're going to talk about that, but also some surprising comments from Ferrari team boss Mattia Binotto, who seemed to suggest that it's some sort of travesty that Formula One hasn't pegged Mercedes back. I've got Ed Straw with me in the studio to talk about this, and I'm delighted to say that all the way from his home in Sweden, I also have our F1 reporter Scott Mitchell with us. Ed, we'll start with you. Just talk us through the background here. We know that there was a vote over the Austrian Grand Prix weekend to bring back the old tyres that failed, and then Ferrari went on this seemingly bizarre tyre raid as if they've been wronged in some way.
Well, yeah, Ferrari is one of the prime movers behind this. In order to get a change of tyre spec, they need a majority of 7 of the 10 teams. So that's how many votes they needed to go back to last year's tyres. These, of course, are the thicker tread tyres, the thicker gauge tyres, because they switched to thinner this year. That was in line with the one they used on 3 occasions last year. And obviously, in terms of the way you work those tyres, less tread means you've got less to sort of squash and to put pressure on, and because basically by moving the tread, that's how you build up temperature and work it. So it's harder to get the tyres working. So Ferrari was a prime mover in creating this meeting. Pirelli will make changes if they've got that 7 of the 10 teams on side, but Ferrari and the other teams that were in favour of it could not get enough support. It was actually an even split, 5-5 in the end, with obviously Mercedes, Williams, Racing Point, McLaren, who were very good on tyres, and Renault were all against the proposal to change things. So, of course, Ferrari, who clearly felt this would be to their advantage, were disappointed, and Mattia Binotto made this comment. He seemed to feel an opportunity to close up the field was missed, which is interesting because it slightly changes the reasoning for doing it, because was the argument that they shouldn't have done it and it was worse for Formula One, or is the argument actually that it'll close things up and hold back Mercedes? And we should add, it's not a completely foregone conclusion that it would have pegged back Mercedes and helped Ferrari. That was one of the things that was discussed. There's always the risk that it might have a slightly different effect. So yeah, ultimately, Ferrari wanted it changed, Mercedes didn't want it changed, and in the end it was 5 on each side, so nothing happens.
Now, Scott, you covered the story about some of Binotto's comments, and I've got some of them written down here. You know, he referred to Austria being a good race because there wasn't a car that was overperforming, i.e. the Mercedes had a bad race. He described making the change as a great opportunity for F1. He then said he was ashamed that the change didn't happen, and as Ed mentioned, a great opportunity to close up the field. If all Ferrari wants here is Mercedes pegged back by effectively a rule change, is there really any excuse for a leading team boss to be saying something like that?
Well, I guess that depends on whether you buy into Binotto's arguments or the argument competitively for changing to the 2018 tyres, because the base of the argument is obviously it's all in the interest of fairness, essentially. It boils down to this idea that effectively the non-Merc cars have been hit with this double whammy, because at the same time as Mercedes' performance has been lifted by being on the thinner tread tyres, the others have been brought down. And the reason for this, or so they say, is that the problem with the 0.4mm thinner tread is that it's really hard, if not impossible, to get the tyre into the working range. And we're not just talking about 1 or 2 laps, apparently. This isn't just about getting them in the right window for qualifying, it's across a stint. You do 10, 15, 20 laps, whatever, and you'll never hit that working range. That's what one of the arguments is. And whether you believe that or not is obviously key to whether you think Binotto's got a point with F1 missing a trick at introducing these tyres. So the idea is that because certain teams have got different aerodynamic philosophies on their car, some of them just don't have quite a high enough peak of downforce, and the argument is that those different philosophies translate onto the track in different ways, and that's where the pros and cons of the aero differences should be. Not because a quirk of the 2019 tyres means that the teams that are pushing the cars down more in terms of aero and downforce are actually getting the tyres to work, whereas the other cars like the Ferrari can't quite do that so effectively. So the argument that Binotto and his pro 2018 tyres colleagues are making is effectively that they're being unfairly punished by a change that was never meant to be a competitive change, really. The whole point of the thinner gauge tyres was on safety grounds, but also allowing drivers to push without fear of blistering. It wasn't meant to be a massive performance differentiator in terms of getting the car or the maximum potential performance of the car working properly. So they argue that they've been unfairly hamstrung on that side, and at the same time Mercedes, traditionally a car that works its tyres harder than most apparently, according to the sort of conventional wisdom within the paddock amongst their rivals, they've basically lucked into this sweet spot, which is a bit of an unfair way of characterising it, but that is essentially the base of the argument. So yeah, it depends what side of the fence you sit. If you agree with that sort of principle, logic, whatever you want to call it, then maybe Binotto does have a point. Conversely, you could argue, well, why didn't you raise this sooner? Mercedes was really quick at the 3 races that had the thinner tread tyre last year, 1-2 on pole and the other one. And the counter argument to that apparently is that there was no reason to think they'd have this adverse effect, and it's taken until this point to build up the data and emphatically say, look, we do everything we can to get these tyres working. We simply can't because the tyres are punishing our car concept, and that's not the way a single make tyre championship is meant to work.
Yeah, it sounds a bit to me like a sort of act of desperation from Ferrari in particular. Do you think that Binotto will maybe go away from the heat of a race weekend and regret those comments, or can you see him and Ferrari standing by them?
He might regret seeing it in headline form. It was obviously a very strong choice of words, and that's probably the only thing I think that he might look at and go, oh, probably could have done that differently. And the reason I say that is because I know 100% he'll stand by the point he was making. You can maybe argue that the language is a bit too strong, but fundamentally, as I pointed out before in the previous answer, Ferrari do feel very aggrieved at the impact that this has had not only on their performance, but with Mercedes. And there is a deep lying resentment effectively within Ferrari and Red Bull to an extent, and a couple of other teams, especially Haas, who are really flummoxed by the tyres. And this is born out of that frustration that they've been hit by this double whammy of Merc going up and themselves going down. So the feeling is very, very strong, and that's why it was really interesting and not at all insignificant that Binotto made this comment in response to a different question. He wasn't asked, do you think we've missed a trick by not going back to the 2018 tyres? Or now you've had time to reflect, what do you think about the decision to stick with the 2019 tyres? He was asked a slightly different question in the context of drivers racing one another, having an entertaining Grand Prix, and do they need to do something about the rules basically so we don't have these penalties, blah, blah, blah. And Binotto basically pounced and saw it as an opportunity to get across his point, which was that he feels F1 really wronged itself by not backing this position. And Binotto, for all his niceties, is a very, very pleasant man. He's very easy to get along with. But he does have a ruthless streak. You don't become the chief at Ferrari if you don't have that sort of that ability to basically speak without sugarcoating it, shall we say. He does have a steely edge to him. And this is the sort of thing that you see. He's Ferrari through and through. He does have that little bit of steel. So when he says something, he's going to say what he means. And on this occasion, maybe he went a little bit too far, but fundamentally he made the point he wanted to make.
Ed, Scott's given us Ferrari's version of events there and Ferrari's side of the story, but can we really be that sympathetic to a massive F1 team basically claiming that a rule change, it can't do anything about a change that's happened, that it knew was coming over the winter?
Yeah, the rhetoric switched around a little bit. Obviously, this point where Binotto said it would have been good for Formula One. The rule change wasn't specifically and only on safety grounds. It was also to allow drivers to push more, because as you've got less tread, it's harder to overwork the tyres. So I don't blame Ferrari for trying to do this. Of course, you want to try and gain a competitive advantage or eliminate a disadvantage or whatever. But yeah, I think it becomes a very easy thing for them to attack. Obviously, total downforce does play a part in how you work the tyres, but it's important to note that if you're to rank the teams in terms of who gets the tyres to work best front to back, it doesn't correlate exactly with net downforce. McLaren, for example, is in the middle in terms of overall downforce levels, I would imagine, and yet they're working well with the tyres. And it's the nature of controlled tyre suppliers. The tyre's always going to be of certain characteristics, have certain demands, etc. What I think needs to be done is to understand if it was a mistake to make that change, why it wasn't picked up and challenged earlier, because they did have the opportunity to, and whether there's some way to make this less of a problem in the future. There's always going to be complaints because the tyres are so influential. It is literally what connects your car to the track, which is why we talk about tyres so much. So I can understand Ferrari's frustration, but basically you've got two sides. You've got Ferrari saying, well, this is bad for Formula One, it'd be much more fun, it's giving an unfair advantage to Mercedes, we'd have better racing if we didn't have this change. We've got Mercedes saying, as Lewis Hamilton said, well, if we go back to last year's tyres, there'll be loads more management. You don't want to see management, do you? You want to see people be able to push more, and we have been able to. So you've got two sides there. They are both arguing from the perspective of what is best for them, as they should do. They're employed to do that. And I think you've got to be a little bit careful either side arguing, it's for the good of Formula One, because that's not the position they're coming from. They're doing it for their own competitive reasons. I've always got sympathy for teams when they're struggling with the tyres. Haas, for example, fundamentally have a pretty decent car, pretty quick car, but all over the place when it comes to tyres. Look at Kevin Magnussen, who was fifth fastest in qualifying in Austria and then just went nowhere in the race, even from his grid penalty down in 10th, and then was down near the back fairly early on. So, yeah, I don't blame them for trying, but I don't think you can say that it's that you should be ashamed of Formula One because of it. And I think we should probably give Mattia Binotto the benefit of the doubt and say, obviously, he's not a native English speaker, and that may not be the exact nuance he's trying to put across. But he wants what he wants. Toto Wolff and Mercedes want what they want, and on this point, they were going to be a winner and there was going to be a loser. And the fact Ferrari couldn't get two more teams on side, which is always going to be difficult, given the number of Mercedes-aligned teams there are there, means that things stay the same for now.
And just lastly, is it a worrying precedent if we're looking at a team as big as Ferrari basically saying that we need to make changes to disadvantage whoever's at the front? That, for me, is much more concerning, because that's not what Formula One's about.
Well, the good thing is Ferrari will stop saying that if and when they're at the front, won't they? Because that's how it works. So I think all you just need to bear in mind is all teams will be trying to do this. They'll all be trying to play the rules to their advantage, get things changed to their advantage. But yeah, I think we have to be very, very careful about making changes to close things up or whatever. And we should say, last year's tyres were a little bit capricious for people as well. And although they understood them by the end of the season, we should remember that there's no guarantee it would have the impact that everyone expects it to have. And I think that was one of the reasons why they could not get all 7 teams, because there'll be somebody there thinking, we might actually be worse off if we do this. We don't entirely know. But it also means Ferrari have won in another way, because Mattia Binotto still got this excuse that he can point to. And it may be a legitimate excuse, because they're trying to get the best out of the tyres and they can't. But at least it means that that's never kind of going to be tested. Imagine if it had changed and suddenly they were exactly the same as before. Maybe that will happen. Who knows? But no, we can't go around changing rules mid-season just to disadvantage someone who's running away with it. If you want to do that, then you have to have a serious conversation about mechanisms and performance success ballast, things that hold teams back, that can be formulated in the rules, and not these sort of ad hoc changes that are lobbied for.